The bitter wind howled through the empty streets of northern Minnesota, carrying flurries of snow that stung like tiny needles against exposed skin. It was the kind of cold that made even the hardiest locals think twice about venturing outside. But for one young woman trudging through the deepening snow, there was no choice. She had been walking for what felt like hours, her thin jacket doing little to shield her from the merciless winter storm. Her name was Rin, and she wasn't from Earth, though looking at her, you'd never know it. Her people had mastered the art of blending in perfectly with human populations, right down to the smallest detail. But right now, that hardly mattered. What mattered was finding shelter before she froze to death. The navigation system in her small scout ship had malfunctioned, sending her craft spiraling down through Earth's atmosphere. She'd managed to land, or rather, crash, in a remote wooded area outside of town. The ship's emergency protocols had engaged, masking its presence from human detection systems, but the damage was extensive. She'd grabbed what she could and started walking, hoping to find help before the temperature dropped even further. Rin's fingers had long since gone numb, and her legs felt like they were moving through molasses. The lights of the small town ahead seemed to mock her, appearing closer than they actually were. Her people were built to withstand extreme conditions, but even they had their limits. And she was rapidly approaching hers. A particularly strong gust of wind nearly knocked her off her feet. As she stumbled, her frozen fingers lost their grip on the small bag she'd been carrying, her only possession from home. She watched helplessly as it tumbled into a snowbank, disappearing beneath the white powder. Tears froze on her cheeks as she realized she couldn't even feel her hands enough to dig for it. "Just keep moving," she whispered to herself, the words immediately snatched away by the wind. One foot in front of the other. The distant sound of an engine cut through the howling wind, and Rin's heart leaped. Headlights appeared through the curtain of snow, belonging to an old pickup truck making its way slowly down the road. She waved her arms frantically, praying they would see her through the swirling white. The truck slowed, and Rin could have cried with relief. The passenger window rolled down, revealing an elderly man with kind eyes and a weather-beaten face. "Good Lord, child. What are you doing out in this weather?" "Please," Rin managed through chattering teeth, "my car broke down a few miles back. I've been walking." The man didn't hesitate. "Get in, quick. You'll freeze to death out here." Rin's frozen fingers fumbled with the door handle until the man leaned across and opened it from the inside. The blast of warm air from the heater hit her like a physical force as she climbed in, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. "I'm Joe," the man said, already shrugging off his thick outer coat to drape it around her shoulders. "And you look like you've had one hell of a night. My place is just up ahead, my wife Chen's got soup on the stove, and you're welcome to it." Rin wanted to protest, to say she couldn't impose, but her body made the decision for her. She could barely speak through her violent shivering. Joe cranked up the heat even higher and pointed all the vents in her direction. Thank you," she stammered. "I'm Rin." "Well, Rin, you picked quite a night to break down. Weather Service says this is shaping up to be the worst storm we've had in decades." He kept glancing at her with genuine concern as he carefully navigated the snow-covered road. "Where were you headed?" Rin's mind raced. She needed a plausible story that wouldn't raise suspicions. "I was driving to visit my aunt in Duluth. I'm not used to winter driving. Should have checked the weather." Joe nodded sympathetically. "Happens to the best of us. Though usually folks around here know better than to travel when they're calling for a storm like this. You're lucky I was heading back from checking on old Mrs. Peterson. She lives alone out on County Road 7, and I always make sure she's got enough firewood before a big storm hits." The simple kindness in his voice made Rin's throat tight. Here was this human, going out of his way to help not just her, but others in his community, without expecting anything in return. It was exactly the kind of behavior that had first drawn her people's attention to Earth. They turned onto a long driveway, the truck's headlights illuminating a cozy two-story farmhouse. Warm light spilled from the windows, and smoke curled from the chimney. It looked like something from a holiday card, and to Rin's frozen body and weary spirit, it was the most beautiful sight she'd ever seen. "Chen!" Joe called out as he helped Rin up the porch steps. "We've got company." The door opened, releasing a wave of warmth and the smell of cooking. A small woman with silver-streaked black hair took one look at Rin and immediately sprang into action. "Oh, you poor thing. Joe, get her by the fire. I'll fetch some dry clothes and blankets." Before Rin knew what was happening, she found herself seated in front of a crackling fireplace, wrapped in soft blankets, with a mug of hot soup in her trembling hands. Chen fussed over her like a mother hen, insisting she change into dry clothes and making sure she took small sips of the soup to warm up gradually. "You'll stay here tonight, of course," Chen said firmly. Rin took a bite of the cinnamon roll to hide her uncertainty. The flavors exploded on her tongue, sweet, spicy, and completely different from anything in her world. Her people had long since moved past the need for traditional food, sustaining themselves through perfectly calibrated nutrient solutions. She'd forgotten what real food could taste like. "This is amazing," she said honestly, and Chen beamed. "Family recipe," she said proudly. "Been in my grandmother's family for generations." "Speaking of family." She hesitated, exchanging a look with Joe. "We couldn't help but notice you don't have a phone or wallet with you." Rin's fork froze halfway to her mouth. Of course they'd noticed. These kind people had taken her in, but they weren't fools. She began, but Joe held up a hand. "You don't have to explain if you don't want to," he said quietly. "We've been around long enough to know sometimes people need help without wanting to share their stories. But if you're in some kind of trouble." The concern in their voices made Rin's chest ache. Here they were, worried she might be running from something dangerous, when the truth was so much stranger. "It's not like that," she assured them quickly. "I'm not in danger, or running from anyone. It's just..." She stared into her coffee cup, wishing she could tell them everything. "It's complicated. But I promise I'm not bringing any trouble to your door." Chen nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Well, then. Joe needs to check on the animals, and I could use some help in the kitchen. Would you like to learn how to make soup dumplings?" The next few hours passed in a blur of cooking lessons and stories. Chen taught Rin how to fold the delicate dumplings while telling tales of her childhood in Taiwan, of meeting Joe while working as a nurse in Minneapolis, of building a life together in this remote corner of Minnesota. Joe came in periodically, bringing updates about the weather and stories about the neighbors he'd checked on by phone. Rin learned about Mrs. Peterson, who'd lost her husband 2 years ago but refused to leave their farm. About the young couple down the road expecting their first baby in spring. About the high school teacher who organized a network of volunteers to deliver groceries to elderly residents during bad weather. With each story, each small revelation of community and connection, Rin felt her mission shifting. She had been sent to study human society, to evaluate their readiness for first contact. Her people had assumed that humans' technological development would be the key metric. But sitting in this warm kitchen, learning to make food with her hands while listening to stories of ordinary people taking care of each other, she was beginning to understand that they'd been measuring the wrong things. After lunch, Joe announced he needed to check their generator and fuel supplies, just in case. "Want to help?" he asked Rin. "Always good to know these things in winter." She followed him to the barn, where he patiently explained the workings of the generator, the importance of proper fuel storage, the signs of mechanical trouble to watch for. His knowledge wasn't the refined scientific understanding of her people, but it was practical, tested, real. "Been meaning to teach all this to someone," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Our daughter's out in California now, computer programming. We're proud as can be, but sometimes I worry about all this knowledge getting lost. The old ways of doing things, you know? Rin thought about her own world, where so much of their ancient knowledge had been deliberately abandoned in the name of progress. Maybe the old ways and the new ways need each other, she said carefully. Like Chen's traditional recipes made in an electric oven. Joe looked at her with surprising intensity. You might be right about that. He was quiet for a moment, then added, you remind me of her sometimes, our May. Always thinking about things differently, seeing connections others miss. The comparison to their daughter struck Rin deeply. These humans had known her less than a day, yet they'd shared their home, their food, their stories, and now their memories. The trust implicit in that sharing was staggering. Back in the house, Chen was on the ancient-looking landline phone, which had apparently started working again. Yes, we're fine here, she was saying. Got plenty of supplies, and a guest keeping us company. She listened for a moment, then laughed. No, Joe found her walking in the storm last night. Poor thing's car broke down. Another pause. Of course we took her in, Mrs. Peterson. What else would we do? What else would we do? The simple question echoed in Rin's mind as she helped Joe check the windows for drafts. Her people prided themselves on their advanced ethical frameworks, their carefully reasoned approaches to moral decisions. But here was something different, an instinctive, unquestioning kindness that required no philosophical justification. As the short winter day began to fade, Rin found herself by the living room window, watching more snow begin to fall. Somewhere out there was her ship, her missing bag, her original mission. But here, in this warm house with these extraordinary ordinary humans, she was beginning to understand that she might have found something far more valuable than any of those things. The second night brought unexpected visitors. As Chen taught Rin how to knit, a skill that fascinated her with its mathematical precision disguised as art, headlights swept across the snow-covered yard. Joe went to the door, returning with two snow-covered figures, a young police officer and a tow truck driver. Sorry to intrude, the officer said, introducing himself as Officer Kai Patel. We're checking on stranded travelers. Got a report about an abandoned car, but we can't find it. Thought we'd check if anyone here knew anything about it. Rin's fingers tightened on her knitting needles. She'd known this moment would come, had spent hours preparing her story, but anxiety still coiled in her stomach. That would be mine, she said, keeping her voice steady. It broke down several miles back, but I'm not sure exactly where. Everything looked the same in the storm. The tow truck driver, a weathered woman who introduced herself as Yuki, pulled out a tablet. We've covered every road within 20 miles. No sign of any vehicle, abandoned or otherwise. She looked at Rin with professional curiosity. You sure about where you left it? Before Rin could respond, Joe stepped in. Storm was terrible last night. Visibility was near zero, she's lucky she found our place at all. Cars probably buried under all this snow. Officer Patel nodded thoughtfully. That's happening a lot with this storm. We'll keep looking once the weather clears. Main thing is you're safe. He paused, pulling out a notepad. Still, I should take down some information. Insurance might want a report. Rin's heart raced. She had studied Earth's documentation systems, but creating false credentials hadn't been part of her mission parameters. Just as panic began to rise, Chen appeared with mugs of hot chocolate. Oh, you must be frozen, she exclaimed, pressing the mugs into their hands. Kai, how's your mother? I heard she was under the weather. The young officer's professional demeanor softened. Much better, Mrs. Lee. Those herbs you sent over really helped. Grandmother's remedies never fail, Chen said proudly. Now, about that report, can it wait until the roads are clear? Poor Rin still recovering from her ordeal, and her phone was in the car with all her documents. Officer Patel hesitated, then nodded. Of course. No rush, we're all neighbors here. He turned to Rin. Just stop by the station when you can, okay? We'll sort everything out then. After they left, Rin sat heavily in her chair, the knitting forgotten in her lap. She'd been naive to think she could keep her story straight forever. Soon, they would realize there was no car to find. Her carefully constructed cover would unravel like a poorly knitted scarf. You know, Joe said carefully, settling into his armchair, when I was young, I spent some time in Vietnam. Air Force. Saw lots of people who needed help but couldn't tell their whole story. Learned sometimes it's better not to ask too many questions. Chen touched his shoulder gently, a gesture that spoke of years of shared understanding. What matters is you're safe now, she told Rin. The rest will sort itself out. Their trust, their willingness to accept her despite their obvious questions, brought tears to Rin's eyes. On her world, such uncertainty would never be tolerated. Everything was documented, verified, proven. But here, in this house, she was learning about a different kind of truth, one built on compassion rather than facts. Later that night, unable to sleep, Rin stood at her window watching the moonlight on the snow. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world transformed into crystalline white. She could see her footprints from earlier, when she'd helped Joe check on the chickens, already filling with fresh powder. A flash of light in the distance caught her eye, brief, pulsing, familiar. Her heart stopped. It was the emergency beacon from her ship, finally activating. Soon, her people would come looking for her. They would expect a report, evidence, conclusions about humanity's readiness for contact. What would she tell them? That she had found a species capable of tremendous technological achievement, yes, but more importantly, one that had preserved something her own people had lost generations ago, the ability to trust without proof, to help without guarantee of return, to love without logical reason. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Chen, holding a thick leather-bound book. Couldn't sleep either, the older woman asked, settling onto the window seat beside Rin. I thought you might like to see something. She opened the book, a photo album, to reveal pictures of a much younger Chen and Joe, standing with a group of people in front of a ramshackle building. This was our first year here, Chen explained. We bought this place when everyone said we were crazy. A Chinese immigrant and a white veteran, taking over a failing farm in the middle of nowhere. She smiled at the memory. But the community didn't care about any of that. They showed up to help us repair the roof, taught us about crop rotation, brought us casseroles when we had no time to cook. She turned more pages, showing Rin photos of barn raisings, community picnics, graduations, weddings. That's why we took you in without questions, she said softly. Because 30 years ago, this community took us in the same way. Rin stared at the photos, understanding dawning. Her mission had been to evaluate humanity's advancement, but she'd been looking for the wrong signs. True civilization wasn't measured in technological achievements or scientific knowledge, but in moments like these, in communities that held together, in kindness passed down through generations, in trust given freely without demand for proof. The beacon pulsed again in the distance, but Rin barely noticed. She was too busy listening as Chen turned another page, ready to share another story of how this small corner of Earth had taught her the true meaning of home. Dawn broke on the third day with an urgency Rin couldn't ignore. The beacon's pulsing had grown stronger overnight, visible now even in daylight, a subtle shimmer in the air that only she could see. Her people would arrive soon, perhaps within hours. The thought filled her with both relief and an unexpected dread. She found Joe in the barn early that morning, trying to repair an old tractor. Without being asked, she slid beneath it beside him, her enhanced vision instantly identifying the problem in the ancient machinery. "Hand me that wrench," she asked, pointing to a tool she shouldn't have known the name of. Joe passed it without comment, but she caught the curious look in his eyes. She had been getting careless, letting little bits of impossible knowledge slip through. Whether from comfort or fatigue, her careful facade was cracking. "You know," Joe said casually, watching her repair something that should have taken an expert mechanic hours to diagnose, "Chen and I were talking last night about the strange lights in the woods." Rin's hand stilled on the wrench. "Lights? Like nothing we've ever seen before. Started after that storm you arrived in." He wiped his hands on a rag, his eyes kind but knowing. "Funny thing is, they're right about where you said your car broke down. Except there's no car there, is there?" The wrench slipped from Rin's fingers, clattering against the concrete floor. She slid out from under the tractor, her heart pounding. This was the moment she had dreaded, the moment of discovery, of potential fear and rejection. But Joe's expression held no fear, no anger. Only a gentle curiosity and something that looked remarkably like concern. "You don't have to tell us everything," he said softly. "But if you're in some kind of trouble, if you need help." Tears welled in Rin's eyes. "I'm not in trouble. Not exactly. But I haven't been honest with you, and you and Chen have been so kind." A commotion outside interrupted her confession. Chen's voice called out urgently from the house. "Joe! The news, you need to see this." They hurried inside to find Chen staring at the television. The local news was showing shaky cell phone footage of what they were calling unexplained atmospheric phenomena, lights in the sky, electromagnetic disturbances, mysterious patterns in the snow. All centered around the area where Rin's ship had crashed. "They're saying government scientists are on their way," Chen said, her voice tight with worry. "Military too, probably." Rin's blood ran cold. This was exactly what she had been trained to prevent, drawing attention, causing panic, interfering with Earth's natural development. She had to leave, immediately, before things got worse. "I have to go," she blurted out, already heading for the door. "I'm so sorry, I never meant for any of this to happen." "Wait." Chen caught her arm. "At least let us drive you. The temperatures dropped again, and wherever you're going." "You don't understand," Rin said, desperate now. I'm not who you think I am. I'm not even what you think I am." "We know," Joe said simply. Rin froze. "What?" "Well, we don't know exactly," Chen amended, still holding Rin's arm. "But we know you're different. Special. We've lived long enough to recognize when something extraordinary comes into our lives. And we know you're kind," Joe added. "Gentle. Curious about everything. Whatever else you are, those things matter more." A new light flashed in the distance, different from the beacon. Rin recognized it instantly, a scout ship, beginning its descent. Her people had arrived sooner than expected. "Please," she whispered, looking between these humans who had become so dear to her in such a short time. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to believe me, even though it will sound impossible." They sat at the kitchen table, the heart of this home that had sheltered her, and Rin told them everything. About her world, her mission, the crash. With each word, she waited for disbelief, for rejection. Instead, she found acceptance, wonder, and an unwavering compassion that brought fresh tears to her eyes. "So these lights," Chen said when Rin finished, "they're your people? Coming to take you home?" Rin nodded. "But they're coming with expectations. They'll want to know if Earth is ready for contact, if humans can handle the truth about the universe. They'll look for advanced technology, for scientific achievements, for proof of civilization's progress." "And what will you tell them?" Joe asked quietly. Rin looked around the kitchen, at the mix of old and new, Chen's traditional herbs drying next to a modern coffee maker, Joe's handmade wooden spoons beside the electric stove, generations of family photos next to a digital tablet. She thought about the community that had welcomed strangers 30 years ago, and the one that still looked after its elderly neighbors during storms. "I'll tell them the truth," she said. "That humanity's greatest advancement isn't in your technology or your science. It's in your hearts. In your ability to take in strangers, to trust without proof, to show kindness without guarantee of return. These are things my people lost long ago in our rush for progress." The scout ship's engines were audible now, a low hum that made the windows vibrate slightly. Chen squeezed Rin's hand. "Will you come back?" she asked. "After you report to your people?" "I'm not sure I'm going with them," Rin said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "There's so much more I need to learn here. So much more I need to understand about what makes humans, human." Zhou and Chen exchanged a look, one of those silent conversations that spoke of decades of partnership. "Well then," Chen said, standing up and reaching for her coat, "we better go explain that to them, shouldn't we?" Rin stared at them in confusion. "We? You showed up in a storm, seeking shelter," Zhou said, putting on his boots. "We took you in. Made you family. That's not changing just because you're from another planet." But it could be dangerous," Rin protested. "My people, they might not understand." Chen smiled, the same smile she'd worn when teaching Rin to make dumplings. "Then we'll help them understand. That's what family does." The three of them stepped out into the crisp morning air, the snow crunching under their boots. Above them, the scout ship was becoming visible, its outline shimmering as it descended. But Rin wasn't afraid anymore. She had found something on Earth far more powerful than any advanced technology. She had found a home, and people willing to stand beside her no matter what came next. The scout ship touched down in the snow-covered field behind the farmhouse, its landing creating a perfect circle of melted snow. Rin stood between Zhou and Chen, their presence giving her strength as the ship's exterior shimmered and a doorway materialized. Her heart thundered in her chest as three figures emerged, tall, elegant beings who, like her, wore human appearances that were almost too perfect. The leader, wearing the silver insignia of a first-contact assessor, stepped forward. "Agent Rin," they said in their native language, a sound like wind through crystal. "We've been concerned about your prolonged silence." Rin responded in the same language, aware of Zhou and Chen watching with quiet amazement. "Assessor Dal. I apologize for the delay in communication. My ship was damaged in the landing." Dal's eyes flickered to the humans standing protectively on either side of her. "We see you've made some local connections. That wasn't part of your mission parameters." "No," Rin agreed, switching to English for Zhou and Chen's benefit. "It wasn't part of the plan. But sometimes the most valuable discoveries aren't the ones we're looking for." The other two beings, security officers by their insignias, shifted uncomfortably at her use of human language. Dal's perfect features showed a hint of disapproval. "You've gone native," they said, still using their own language. "Your judgment has been compromised by excessive involvement with the subjects of your study." "Subjects?" Chen stepped forward, her small frame somehow matching the alien's imposing height. "Is that what you think we are? Experiments in a laboratory?" Dal blinked, startled by the human's boldness. "You understand us?" "No," Chen said firmly. "But I understand that tone. I heard it plenty when I first came to this country. People thinking they were better, more advanced, more civilized." She took Rin's hand. "They were wrong then, and you're wrong now." Zhou moved to Rin's other side. "Your ship thing there is mighty impressive. But technology isn't everything. Sometimes the most advanced thing you can do is simply be kind." Rin felt tears threatening again, but she stood straighter. "They're right, Assessor. We've been measuring advancement all wrong. Yes, humans still fight wars. Yes, they struggle with inequality and prejudice. But they also take in strangers during storms. They check on elderly neighbors. They remember recipes passed down through generations and share them with anyone willing to learn. These are emotional arguments, Dal countered. We need objective measurements, scientific data. Then let me show you, Rin interrupted. She turned to Chen. May I? Chen nodded, understanding somehow what Rin needed. She led the group into the house, into the kitchen that had become Rin's favorite place on Earth. Look, Rin said, gesturing to the space around them. Really look. Here's your data, a home that runs on both electricity and wood fire. Medicine cabinets that hold both modern pharmaceuticals and traditional herbs. A community that uses smartphones to organize help for their neighbors during storms, then shows up in person to dig each other out. She opened Chen's recipe book, points to the notes in the margins. They preserve their history while embracing the future. They maintain their traditions while adapting to change. And most importantly, she met Dal's eyes directly. They do something we lost centuries ago, they trust. Trust is inefficient, one of the security officers objected. It leads to exploitation, to chaos. Or to this, Joe interrupted, pulling out his phone. He pulled up a community message board showing dozens of posts, people offering generators during power outages, sharing extra firewood, organizing volunteer snow plowing. This is what you're really here to evaluate, isn't it? Rin asked Dal. Not their technological advancement, but their readiness for contact. Their capacity to handle the truth about the universe without falling into chaos? Dal studied the phone screen, then looked around the kitchen. Their perfect features showed the first signs of genuine emotion, confusion, curiosity, and something that might have been wonder. You believe they're ready? They asked Rin quietly. I believe they're more ready than we are, Rin replied. We've spent so long perfecting our technology that we've forgotten how to connect heart to heart. We've eliminated uncertainty from our lives, but also eliminated trust. We've achieved perfect efficiency, but lost the joy of making things by hand, of taking time to teach, of helping without expecting return. A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see police cars and what looked like military vehicles approaching along the snow-covered road. It's time to leave, the security officers insisted. We've been detected. No, Rin said firmly. It's time to trust. She turned to Dal. Let me show you one more thing about humans. Let me show you how they handle their first official contact. Mrs. Lee, she said, you and your husband took in an alien visitor during a snowstorm, discovered she was part of an advanced civilization studying humanity, and your response was to make coffee and dumplings. Why? Chen looked surprised at the question. What else would we do? Everyone needs kindness, even aliens. Especially aliens, maybe. Being far from home is hard, no matter what planet you're from. One of the government scientists spoke up eagerly. But surely you must have questions about their technology? Their scientific achievements? The mysteries of the universe? Oh, sure, Joe said, leaning against the counter. But seems to me those answers will come in time. Right now, we're just people sharing a meal. Even if some of us are from a bit further away than others. Dal turned to Rin, speaking in their native language. Is this typical? This response? More typical than you'd think, Rin replied in English, wanting everyone to understand. Humans surprise you. They can be fearful, yes, and sometimes that fear leads to violence. But they're also capable of extraordinary acceptance, of finding common ground in the simple acts of daily life. She picked up one of Chen's dumplings. Look at this. It's a recipe passed down through generations, from a culture thousands of years old. Chen learned it from her grandmother, who learned it from hers. But she didn't keep it as a secret family treasure, she shared it with me, an alien, simply because I showed interest in learning. That's not significant data, one of the security officers protested. Isn't it? Admiral Watanabe challenged. Your civilization is clearly more technologically advanced than ours. But from what I'm hearing, you've lost something we still have, the ability to trust, to share, to build connections across differences. Outside, the winter sun was setting, painting the snow-covered fields in shades of gold and pink. More vehicles were arriving, news vans, probably, though the military had established a perimeter around the farm. Soon, the whole world would know about this moment. What happens now? Joe asked, voicing the question everyone was thinking. Dal stood, every movement perfectly controlled. According to our protocols, this premature contact should be erased. Your memories adjusted, all evidence removed. No, Rin interrupted firmly. No more protocols. No more evaluating from a distance. If we want to understand humanity, we need to learn from them, not just study them. She's right, Admiral Watanabe agreed. And if you're worried about how Earth will handle this knowledge, look around this room. Look at how we're handling it right now. Chen stepped forward, refilling Dal's coffee cup. Stay, she said simply. All of you. Stay and learn about us while we learn about you. Share your stories while we share our food. Isn't that better than protocols and procedures? Dal looked around the kitchen, at the military officers relaxing over coffee, at the scientists engaging in excited conversation with the security officers, at Joe teaching one of the alien visitors how to properly hold a dumpling. Finally, their perfect features softened into a genuine smile. Perhaps, they said, it's time for our civilization to do some learning of our own. Hours later, after most of the officials had left to begin the monumental task of preparing the world for the reality of alien life, Rin sat on the farmhouse porch with Joe and Chen. The alien ship glowed softly in the field, its presence now a symbol of hope rather than secrecy. Will you stay? Chen asked, wrapping a quilt around Rin's shoulders, the same one that had warmed her that first night. Rin looked at the house that had become her home, at the humans who had become her family. Yes, she said. My people need to understand what I've learned here. And I'm not done learning either. Good, Joe said, his eyes twinkling. Because you still haven't mastered Chen's dumpling technique. Chen laughed, reaching for both their hands. Together, they watched the stars emerge above the snowy fields, stars that no longer represented distant, unknowable points of light, but bridges between civilizations, built not through advanced technology or complex protocols, but through the simple, profound power of human kindness. From that winter night forward, the farmhouse in Minnesota became more than just a home. It became a symbol of humanity's first step into a larger universe, a step taken not with weapons or suspicion, but with open hearts, warm food, and the unshakable belief that even across the vast distances of space, we can find family in the most unexpected places. And it all began with a snowstorm, a stranger seeking shelter, and two humans who chose kindness over fear, proving that sometimes, the most advanced civilizations are not those that reach for the stars, but those that remember to keep their hearts open to the wonders that the stars might bring to their door.